Hi everyone, this week's lecture is about ethics with vulnerable groups. This is for week 7. So as usual, just got a short agenda for what we're going to talk about here in this lecture. We'll talk about sort of where we are in the course in the grand scheme of things, then spend a few minutes talking about ethics with vulnerable groups, and then we'll conclude the lecture by talking about the discussion for this week. It's a little different, and then we'll talk about the topic paper, which is Appendix C. That's the next big written assignment that's coming up in this course. So let's think about where we are here in the grand scheme of things. This is week 7 of a 10-week course, so the end of the semester very much is in sight. Last week we talked about ethical decision-making models. This week, and really for the balance of the course, we're going to talk about ethical issues in specific practice settings and then ethical issues working with specific populations. We start this week with vulnerable groups, and we'll start talking about that here on the next slide. The reading for this week is just one article, and the reading this week is about the difference between ethical reasoning processes that create a hierarchy among ethical principles, so that prioritize certain principles over others, and then ethical reasoning models that do not create a hierarchy between different ethical principles. And that's important when we start talking about ethical practice here with vulnerable groups. So let's start by talking about what constitutes an elderly group. I'm sorry, what constitutes a vulnerable group, excuse me. So I've got some examples listed of vulnerable groups here on this slide. And most of us can think of vulnerable populations if we're asked to. People who are elderly, people with disabilities, people who are poor, minors, members of the LGBTQIA plus community, might also be considered vulnerable groups. Social work throughout its history as a profession has really always advocated for people who are vulnerable. We've most often dealt with people who are oppressed by structures or systems in society. And we have a long history of sort of advocating and working with this group, or with these groups. So by no means is this an exhaustive list of a vulnerable group. In fact, it's not very hard to make the case that any group of people is a vulnerable group. One of the things I can tell you, when we talk about vulnerable groups, we often use person-first language. So I've done that here on this slide for a couple of these bullet points. So take, for example, the phrase or the construct people with disabilities. That's an example of person-first language. If I were to phrase this in a non-person-first way, it might be phrased something like a disabled person or a poor person. What that does is that puts the vulnerability label first ahead of the person, and person-first language actually flips that on its head and says, people are people first, and they're people who have some kind of identity associated with a vulnerable group. So we could say people who are elderly, people who are under the age of 18 or 21, or people who are members of the LGBTQIA population. Person-first language is something that's really been championed by the social work profession. It's widely adopted, and it's generally a good habit to get into as you move through a graduate program and into the professional world. So person-first language, excuse me, and then again, the other sort of important takeaway from this slide is that vulnerable groups are people who have experienced some kind of systemic oppression, usually, and that definition is pretty broad, and it's not terribly difficult to make the case that many different groups of people ultimately are kind of vulnerable. So a couple of ethical issues to think about working with vulnerable groups. Our work should never blame the victim. Our work should really always empower people. Victim blaming is this idea that the victim is partly or wholly responsible for the harm that that they experienced. So the classic sort of example of victim blaming is a sexual assault survivor who um, maybe is victim blamed by people who say, well, she shouldn't have dressed that way, or she shouldn't have gotten drunk or been under the influence of drugs or alcohol or something like that. That idea is that the victim's actions there somehow brought the harm onto them, and really the issue here is that a person who perpetrates a crime is always the person who's responsible for the crime. The victim is never responsible for her or his circumstances. So our work should never, ever, ever blame the victim. And with all of these vulnerable groups, maybe the exception is excuse me, the elderly. But for most members of vulnerable groups, there's always some kind of national discourse about victim blaming. So the classic sort of victim blaming line for people who are poor is, well, they're poor because they didn't work hard enough, or they're poor because they didn't go to school, or they're poor because they made bad choices about money or something like that. That's a victim blaming mentality. I suppose minors are probably the other group that you sort of can't or sort of aren't applicable to victim blaming, since time sort of progresses for everyone. Um, but but again, lots of examples of victim blaming. And the issue with victim blaming really is that it's sort of the opposite of empowerment. It's actually sort of disempowering. Um, and generally a pretty toxic thing to do. So our work should never blame the victim, but our work should empower. And empowering, this is the definition that I tend to think about empowerment. It's really supporting people as they realize that they're able to take steps, and then as they take steps to change their situation. That's sort of how I think about empowering. But you'll encounter lots of different definitions in the MSW program about empowerment. So let's talk a little bit about what the reading said here. So the reading, I like it this week because it's pretty short. First of all, so this is sort of a chance to take a little bit of a breather in this course. But among the decision-making models that propose a hierarchy among ethical principles, the benefit of these is that they may actually make ethical decision-making easier. The higher ranked principle is simply the one that prevails. That's the one that should take precedence. So you act in service of the higher ranked ethical principle. And it may be appropriate for new or entry level social workers, people who are just entering the field, to choose a model that proposes a hierarchy among ethical principles. However, people who are sort of especially concerned with social justice or advocacy or working with vulnerable groups may want to consider ethical reasoning ethical reasoning models that do not propose a hierarchy among ethical principles. The benefit of that is that they don't establish or they don't replicate sort of this established order of ethical principles. It really provides an opportunity to prioritize some other ethical principle, and that ethical principle might be something that's really in service of or a benefit to the client or the member of the vulnerable population that the social worker is working with. So I would make the argument that ethical reasoning models that do not propose a hierarchy among ethical principles are a little bit more intellectually involved, but they ultimately result in better ethical reasoning. And my encouragement to all of you would be to pursue a model that does not propose a hierarchy among ethical principles. So to conclude sort of the brief section here on ethical issues with vulnerable groups, ethical reasoning really should improve the individual's situation and reduce the oppression faced by the group, but faced by that vulnerable group. So it should include sort of both micro and macro kinds of action. It's a very difficult thing to do, but that's sort of why our profession has existed for the last 150 or so years. Let's spend a few minutes talking about the discussion for this week next. So the discussion is a little bit different, and all I've done here is basically copy what is on Moodle. It's just a different font since the default font of Moodle and PowerPoint is a little bit different here. So this isn't a discussion, but it'll count as a discussion. This is actually going to be an email to me. And part of what we're going to do here is in this email, you're going to identify a topic for the topic paper syllabus. Then you're going to take a couple of minutes, 15 minutes, half an hour, whatever you can spare, to engage in some self-care. That's listed in point number 2 there. And then the third thing you're going to do is let me know if you're having any issues or problems with the course. And if you're not, that's fine. You can just let me know. So we're going to talk about the topic paper here next. So that'll give you some more information to respond to question 1 here. But for question 2, since the material is a little bit light for this week, this lecture won't be very long and there's only 1 reading. Take a chance to participate in some self-care. Believe it or not, I would make the argument that that practicing self-care is an ethical issue, and we have to make time for it in our professional lives. So, to model that in the education phase of one's career, I'm going to include self-care in our course activities for this week. So take a chance to engage in some self-care. Might include, what you do for self-care is completely up to you. I've given you just a couple of examples. It could be writing in a journal, taking a walk with a friend or a loved one or a pet, getting some ice cream, sitting in a favorite park, reading a book you've been wanting to read, so on and so forth. Let me know what you did, and then let me know if it worked. And let me know what makes self-care a challenge in your life. But as I said, I think self-care really is an ethical issue, and this is my attempt to work it into our professional lives. As for this email, if you plan to email me on Thursday or Friday, even Wednesday, anytime this week is fine. That would work for me. If you're having trouble identifying a topic for the topic paper, you're welcome to email me as well. So here, all I've done is just taken a screenshot of what's in the syllabus. This is Appendix E. It's the topic paper. Your task really, let me just move myself here a little bit, is to consider some of the ethical issues associated with some area of social work practice. What area of social work practice that is completely up to you. More on that in a second. So there's really 2 sort of big sections. Section A, which is about half of the paper, and that is listed here in the description. So topic overview. That's Section A. Section A introduces the topic and explains how social workers are involved in that area of practice. Section B, sort of the second half of the paper, is your chance to construct an ethical dilemma and explain how you would resolve or reason your way through that ethical dilemma. So that's really going to require you to do 2 things. It's going to require you to identify all of the ethical principles involved, and then you're also going to need to work through an ethical reasoning process. Where would you get an ethical reasoning process? Well, you would get it from the article for this week or any of the articles from last week. Which one you choose is completely up to you. Like I said in last week's lecture, the goal, the point or the goal here of last week's information and this week's information was really for you to have some beginning familiarity with an ethical reasoning model of your choice. And this is in this paper. This is where you're going to let me know what ethical model you've sort of chosen to root your practice in. So, as I said a second ago, the topic is really, it is completely up to you. It is something about which you should be passionate, or maybe someplace where you see yourself working in the future, you aspire to work. What I've done here on this slide is just provide a brief example of maybe something you could write about for for this paper. So the topic might be opioid agonist therapies. So an opioid agonist is something like methadone or bupropion. Bupropion. These are typically synthetic opiates that provide they block the receptors that opioids act on. So they ease craving and withdrawal, and they help people sort of remain abstinent from opiates. Social workers, obviously, we don't prescribe methadone maintenance or any of the agonists, but we're all often involved as behavioral health clinicians, especially at the MSW level, and certainly in a lot of methadone maintenance clinics, there's case managers, and those folks are often BSWs. So despite their effectiveness, though, opioid agonist therapies have some ethical dilemmas. They work for clients, and that's ethical principle 1.01 in the Code of Ethics. However, they're fairly costly to society. And so despite the fact they work, they cost an awful lot of money, and they cost a lot of money for a very long time. And so the other principle that might be in conflict there is ethical principle 6.01, which is the social welfare ethical principle. So that would be an example of a topic and just two ethical principles that might be in conflict. A second example, this is more of a micro level example. I've listed just here at the bottom of the slide. Suppose a client wants to quit opioids on their own. That would be in service of ethical principle 1.02, which is self-determination. But perhaps, again, this is just a purely hypothetical situation. Perhaps they've tried and failed before to quit. And we know that opioid agonist therapies work. And continued use by this client is costly or detrimental to society. So in that case, ethical principle 1.02 would be in conflict with ethical principles 5.02 and 6.01. So a few thoughts about the paper. The topic is completely up to you. It should be something about which you're passionate. All areas of social work practice have issues, all of them. There are no exceptions to that. The other thing to consider here is that there's really no right or wrong answer to any part of this paper. This is really about working through the ethical reasoning process. Your grade on the paper will really be based on a couple of things. It's based on your adherence to the ethical reasoning process that you choose, and your insight. And your insight is really about the extent to which you've considered all of the ethical issues that are involved. I also grade a little bit on clarity and adherence to APA, sentence structure, and those technical kinds of things as well. But like I said, this isn't really about arriving at a right answer or the answer that I would arrive at. It's entirely reasonable that two people arrive at completely different answers. This is really about adhering to the process. Lastly, as with anything in this course, if you're having trouble identifying a topic or you have questions about it, let me know. Give me a call, shoot me an email. I'm happy to help you pick out a topic. If you've got a topic about which you're interested in, the sort of faux discussion for this week shouldn't be much of a challenge. Then you can let me know. I will respond to that email and give you some feedback about that topic. And we'll go from there. So as always, you have questions or if you have problems, feel free to shoot me an email. Thanks for watching.